What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and I'm so excited to bring another episode of Why Nobody Plays slash What Happened. Because as I think more about this, we're kind of just seeing like the rise and fall of some of these cards. Unfortunately, today's victim is a card that I think kind of misses, the balance in terms of like when it was released and how powerful it was versus how powerful it is now, and getting some personal accounts from like other players and stuff that I've met through my journey of playing competitive Magic. We're going to kind of get a little bit of an insight on Bitterblossom, when it was released, things that, happened, like in basically what made it such a deceptively powerful card, and even by today's standards, still a decently powerful effect, even if it's not like as ubiquitously played as it was on its release. So before I get too deep into it, of course, if you are not already subscribed to the channel and you want to support my content, free easiest way to do that: subscribe, ring notification bell so you know when videos get posted. Join the link in the description down below to the Discord server. I would really appreciate it. It helps me out a lot. It keeps me making content, all that good stuff. So here we have Bitterblossom. For the uninitiated, Bitterblossom is a black and 1 generic for a tribal enchantment, which is pretty thematic for the just Lorwyn block period, having like tribal spells. Real quickly, tribal spells essentially go to specific creature types, and they end up being a part of them. So like this is a tribal enchantment fairy. It is a fairy tribal enchantment. There was like certain cards that would allow you to search your library for a X creature type card. Like Bitterblossom would be searchable if you could search for a fairy type card. Things like that, just something interesting, and I believe that even in like the reprint sets, obviously if it was a tribal card, there was a tribal card, but I don't think there's been any other tribal cards printed, since Lorwyn block, and probably never again. But nonetheless, it is its own unique typing. But this one in particular, says at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose life, and you put a 1/1 Black Fairy Rogue creature token with flying into play. Now, super basic. We've looked at a decent amount of planeswalkers on this channel. We looked at various different decks that have a few different layers to them. Bitterblossom is super basic in what it does, yet it was super effective in how it executed that game plan. So we're looking at February 1st, 2008. Bitterblossom is released, and Fairies at the time is one of the best decks in the format. Now, while I don't deny that people knew that Bitterblossom was a very powerful effect and that people should be playing this card, I mean, it varies from like what I gather from other players. It was like the most ubiquitously played deck. There was even one player that I talked to, like way back in like the late 2010s, that said that they went to like a PTQ or a PPTQ, what have you, some kind of qualifier, and just played mirror matches all day, like through the Swiss rounds to the top 8, everything. Just played mirror matches, like it just to show you like how much better this the fairies deck in total was, and kind of how good Bitterblossom is as well as being like a facilitator of that. And when we look at because we'll look at a deck list on the on Blueback Fairies and kind of explain a little bit of, like the nuances and stuff. Bitterblossom kind of got to be the linchpin in this, where today there's some control decks that you see kind of like play, in terms of like Murktide, you see him play like Ragavan, play like used to be Ledger Shredder. And at that point, you just kind of play like pretty reactive, like maybe you would cast cantrips and whatnot on your turn, or maybe add like another threat to the board if your mana allowed it. But then from that point on, you're just leaving up mana for potential counter spells, be able to spell pierce your opponent's spells, react to them, flash in any other threats and stuff. And this is kind of maybe not like the progenitor, because Magic at that point had been around for I believe 14 to 15 years, something close to that. And obviously there's been a lot of innovation from that point. But Fairies kind of put it all together and made it miserable. At least like when we look at the deck list, like if you at least like keep in mind of the times, like it was probably pretty miserable to like play against, and just having to deal with this, and especially at like such a high metagame usage at the time as well. I mean, it was just very annoying. And again, like Bitterblossom, no exception, was probably one of the most powerful cards in the deck. So kind of like some quick math and everything on it before we jump over to the deck. Bitterblossom essentially, like, you lose life, you get a 1/1. Now the 1/1 can't attack this turn, but then you lose a second life, and you can attack with 1. You make a blocker, and then at a certain point, I believe it's like after the third turn, it being in play and it triggering, you end up like being at parity with your opponent. Like you're able to deal them 3 damage, you lose 3 life, you have 3 creatures in play, and then at that point, like you lose 1, they take 3. So you lost 4, they've lost 6. Then they take 10, and you lost 5. And then they take 15, and you've lost 6, and just so on. Like, the longer that Bitterblossom stays in play and the sooner that you get Bitterblossom down, the more damage and potential output that you have for Bitterblossom. And the fact that it's making it into, an individual 1/1 every single turn, rather than, a card that was actually printed in War of the Spark that people compared to Bitterblossom, where it just made one singular creature bigger, and then even had like a benefit for that creature being a certain size. Bitterblossom, at least comparatively to the two, is miles more powerful than that, simply for the fact that you kind of get to go wide. Fairies in general just have a lot of synergy with each other. And even for like the time, if you just play like Bitterblossom, and then from that point on left up mana, you get to play cards like Spellstutter Sprite, which we'll see. There's also a few Fairy Lords, so I mean, even if you play like a Lord, your Bitterblossom, by like a turn sooner, will end up netting you more damage than it's dealing to you. And then on top of that too, it's obviously putting out even more damage, as you go on, as you stack more Lords, things like that. Kind of keeping in mind that was kind of the theme of Lorwyn, was these different creature types, and again, fairies by far, at least from personal accounts of people, seemed like to be one of the best decks to be playing at that time. So, with that said, we're gonna jump over. We'll sing Bitterblossom's praises some more, and obviously detail a few things about its downfall, eventually. But we'll look at a 2008 Worlds deck list that prominently featured blue-black fairies in the format. So let's go ahead and jump over there and kind of break down the deck a little bit to get a better understanding of how Bitterblossom, and kind of like the in practice of how good this card actually was. So here we have the World's like Fairies deck list by Anti-Malin. I definitely butchered that name. I am so sorry. From Worlds 2008, deck by Saffron Olive. I'm sure just added by them. So the main idea of like the Fairies deck is that you're essentially a control deck, but you get to at times play proactively. I mean, you have 4 Thoughtseize, which is like absolutely absurd that this card was also printed in like the same set, where you could like Thoughtseize your opponent, and especially in like mirrors, you like take their Bitterblossom, and then or maybe any like their interaction, and then you just play a turn 2 Bitterblossom, and from there, I mean, you just get to leave up mana. Spellstutter Sprite is a card that we pointed out earlier, where it's a 2 mana 1/1 that has flash, flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you counter target spell converting mana cost X or less for the X is the number of fairies you control. So like Bitterblossom too, like these creatures sticking around, like your Spellstutter Sprites got to counter higher costed cards as it went on. Even like Spellstutter Sprite, like leaving up on turn 2 and then like getting to counter like a Thoughtseize or something like that, it's still pretty good as well. It definitely gives you a lot of tempo when your opponent kind of like hinges their game plan on certain things. They also like actively have to like remove your creatures, but in Bitterblossom's case, like if you just remove one of the creatures, that's fine. I'm going to continue to make them. Like, you deal with like a very small part of the card when you deal with one creature and having to deal with it. And like notably in like this blue-black deck in particular, like 4 Cryptic Command, bounce a permanent to its owner's hand. Like that's like one of the ways that you can like essentially delay a Bitterblossom like a turn. I mean, you essentially get to miss like 2 turns for 1 activation, but like that's just crazy. I mean, you Cryptic Command it, and then you kind of hope to maybe like Spellstutter Sprite it, or Broken Ambitions it, and stop your opponent from getting the benefit of a Bitterblossom. Notably, like even further, we have like Vendilion Click, which was like a Modern staple in the early portions of Modern, and even people playing it, as late as like the mid to late 2010s. I'm sure there's probably people out there that still try to play it. Obviously, we know that like 1 toughness creatures in the Modern format currently need to be very, very good if they want to see any sort of play, and Vendilion Click, unfortunately, probably for the now times, is not that good, and probably could have its own Why Nobody Plays video. But Vendilion Click getting to look at your opponent's hand, and the worst feeling in the world is being the person that is getting Vendilion clicked, and your opponent looks at your hand and just says like, yeah, you can keep those, because it usually means one of two things. It means that the stuff that's in your hand, like, they already have answers for. Like, they're just going to be able to easily take care of it, because there's just so much of like the answers themselves they have are very good, or it's just not a threat. Like, they're not even worried about it. Like, that is the worst feeling. Draw stepping this basically means that you had perfect information. You get to see the card your opponent drew, and then if they drew like a combo piece that was relevant, or they drew even a card that was relevant, you just put it to the bottom and let them draw a random one, because more than likely that random card is going to be different from the card that they just drew, especially, or at least the card that you are taking from them. Unless it is specifically Thoughtseize, then that card is already on top of their deck. But you just kind of stop them from getting to forward their game plan even more. At least like delaying them like another turn or two before eventually like your flying fairies put enough pressure on your opponent that you end up winning the game. Another like unique card from this deck, Mistbind Click, has this thing called Champion a Fairy. Essentially, champion something means that when this creature comes into play, sacrifice unless you remove another fairy you control from the game. When this leaves play, return that card returns to play. So, with Mistbind Click, you could have a Bitterblossom in play, and Bitterblossom counts as like a fairy. So, with the fact like in like these mirror matches, Mistbind Click could just like you could just get rid of your Bitterblossom. Like if your life total was starting to like be in danger, or you already have like 3 or 4 fairies in play, you just champion the Bitterblossom because it is a fairy. Put it under the Mistbind Click, and when this fairy is championed, or when a fairy is championed with Mistbind Click, you tap all lands target player controls. So you get to play this as like a tempo play against your opponent. You got rid of something that was maybe like killing you essentially, and after you've already made like 2, 3, 4 fairies anyway, and you essentially get to time walk your opponent, and then hit them for 3 or 4. And I mean, a 4/4 flyer is huge in the format, especially for 4 mana, and you get to play on your opponent's like their upkeep and everything, and force them to have an answer for this. And like the thing is, like, they don't necessarily come out of it. I mean, there's no point and anywhere on Mistbind Click where they come out ahead. But the only benefit to them is that, like, hey, a Bitterblossom isn't in play, so if I just deal with the Mistbind Click, I'm okay until the Bitterblossom comes back, and then like they're just kind of where they started. They miss a turn for the fact that Mistbind Click just tapped all their lands. They just took a bunch of damage, and like they're untapping into Cryptic Command mana, into possibly getting one of their creatures Agony Warped, or playing into Spellstarter Sprites. We have like 3 fairies in play and a Mistbind Click. We're going to be able to counter a 5 converted mana cost spell with Spellstarter Sprite. It's insane. So obviously I can keep going. Like, Broken Ambition counters a spell unless controllers pay X. It has Clash, which means like they reveal the top card of their library, and then they put that card to the top or bottom. And a player that wins has the higher converted mana cost. So like if you won a clash with an opponent, they would mill 4 cards, and like whatever, like just I guess an additional benefit to Broken Ambition and everything. But getting to play this as like a Force Spike or something like that, where you're just getting to leave up mana, you're hitting your land drops, playing 25 lands. Eventually you're going to be able to cast Broken Ambitions with X being high enough to where you can counter your opponent's spell. It doesn't matter if they can either if they can pay for it, or really they probably can't at that point. It's also kind of a way to like play around Spellstutter Sprite in a way to where like you can overpay for X to where like a Spellstutter Sprite from your opponent wouldn't be able to actually counter the Broken Ambition. So really neat. The Thoughtseize, again, we have talked about it at length on this channel, how good Thoughtseize is, and even in today's format 15, 16 years later, so definitely even back then, with maybe like cards not necessarily being as good or nearly as powerful as cards today, still very good when you can take the best card in the format away from somebody. Remove Soul, just counter target creature spell. something that we see from like Essence Scatter. Of course, we know that there's some very powerful creatures, at least in just the Fairies deck itself. So Remove Soul, pretty good. Terror's removal. Cryptic Command is Cryptic Command that was also printed in the Lorwyn set. There's a lot of good cards that came out of just Lorwyn block period. And again, cards that could end up like on this list. Unfortunately, that Bitterblossom has found itself on. So how does exactly Bitterblossom fit into all this? As I have explained it like 15 times already, Bitterblossom is kind of like the facilitator of this. You have these cards that, like, at least, Spellstutter Sprite has some fairy synergy. Vendilion Click gets to be disruptive. Mistbind Click gets to be super disruptive. Sower Temptation gets to steal a creature for as long as it's on the battlefield. And Bitterblossom is essentially like another threat in this deck. Bitterblossom is going to give you a creature every single turn, and you're going to be able to attack with it, put pressure on your opponent's life total. If your opponent manages to be more aggressive than you, Bitterblossom essentially means that like that big creature that's attacking for 4, 5, 6 damage that doesn't have trample is going to get to block in front of it, and you're going to take 1, and then eventually you're going to find your terrors. Excuse me. You're going to be able to cryptic bounce it, and then maybe counter on the way down. You're going to be able to agony warp them and so on. Even just getting to use Agony Warp in a way where you're not giving a creature -3/-3, but you're giving like a creature that's getting blocked -3/-0, and then killing a creature that has 3 or less toughness as well. With Agony Warp, essentially getting to like 2 for 1 your opponent in that way. One of the earliest forms of 2 for 1 I think we've seen on this channel. So like this deck just getting to be super disruptive, and it got to be that way because Bitterblossom had such a low cost of just playing it on turn 2. Your opponent like playing a 2-drop, but I mean even in like the Fairy Mirrors, like you just had Thoughtseize, so you just preempt a Thoughtseize on turn 1, and playing a Bitterblossom on the play is so backbreaking when people really didn't have any good options of dealing with enchantments. And even if you did, like you had to find like that 1 turn window to where you could like get a Bitterblossom and be able to actually like tag it and kill it, because then from that point on your opponent is just keeping up Spellstar Sprite, Broken Ambition. They're going to be able to Thoughtseize potentially any other copies that you might be holding on to. They have Cryptic Commands of eventually, and getting to every mode on this card just being super relevant. Whether they want to push through damage by tapping all your creatures, bouncing a problematic permanent, countering the next spell that you play, drawing a card, like Time Walk. You have a Time Walk here in Mistbind Click. It's crazy. And Bitterblossom provided that perfect punch of just being a card that people could play and immediately just put pressure on your opponent. Not in the ways that we know where, you play like a 2-mana 5/5 and like Territorial Kavu and like Modern, in terms of like aggressive decks, or like playing an Omnath and then getting to have all these different land synergies and stuff like that. Bitterblossom just straight up was like, I'm going to make a 1/1 every turn. And then from there, like, you have to kill this thing. And if you don't kill this thing, I'm going to continue to make 1/1s every turn. I'm going to outpace the damage that the Bitterblossom is doing to me. And then on top of that, you have to fight through a ton of interaction. A deck that is super interactive, can be proactive when it wants to be in cards like Thoughtseize, and then also just be super reactive with every other card that is in the deck, and continue to be disruptive and be annoying and hit those perfect cards that you could use to actually interact with them, get rid of them, and force you to essentially get lucky and find them again. And this deck, for reasons, was one of the most popular decks of the time for that. And Bitterblossom definitely gets a lot of kudos for that. Of course, there are some other cards in this deck that are, even for the time, are very powerful. But by and large, like Bitterblossom, I think carries a lot of the weight of like why this deck was so good. I think if the deck loses Bitterblossom, is definitely a lot worse, considering now like Spellstutter Sprite a lot of times probably countering like 1 and 2 mana spells, decently regularly, but not as often as it would be able to counter like a 3 or a 4 or a 5, going up, which could be very important for eventually maybe countering some bigger Broken Ambitions, countering things like Cryptic Command and Sower of Temptation, and even Mistbind Click as well. So definitely Bitterblossom, at least in that regard, I think gets a lot of respect, definitely at least for the time, of being a card that is and for now was very powerful, and will continue to kind of live in the shadows of what it once was in standard. So we've talked about great, we flexed how good Bitterblossom is. Let's go ahead, transition back over to the cool original art and kind of explain what the heck happened to this card and why we don't see it in today's metagames. All right, we're back. Light mode is gone, thankfully. I'm just kind of like blinded. Oh my god. So, Bitterblossom. Yeah, Bitterblossom is a card, unfortunately, that doesn't get to see really any play in Modern, and is a card that it feels like, especially if you played with it at the time, is a card that should see play in Modern. I mean, like, while we're not seeing very many aggressive decks, like, if your opponent, like, Furies this, like, you still get a blocker, like, you get a blocker for, like, a Fury every single turn. Like, you're not really benefiting much from, solituding or furying or removing, like, the tokens and stuff. Like, we saw that back in, like, 2008, Worlds, and even just in that metagame period, that, a removal spell is, like, a 1 for 1/10 of like a Bitterblossom. Like it's not good. So why the heck aren't we seeing Bitterblossom today? Power creep I think is the easy lazy answer for it. Obviously, we have cards like Omnath now where you can just gain insane amounts of life, get insane amounts of like mana advantage as well as like card advantage in a lot of scenarios as well. And on top of that, just in general, like the average card quality of a card, or of a card in like Modern and even in Pioneer as well, if we were able to see Bitterblossom come back in that capacity, which might actually be interesting if we have like a Return to Lorwyn and we see something like Bitterblossom come back, especially in a format then where it gets reunited with Thoughtseize and a little bit lower of a power level. So while card quality has definitely gone up, and like just like the average power level of the card is a lot higher than a card from the original Lorwyn block. Just the utility and stuff that Bitterblossom offers definitely can extend past the fairies archetype, but is also kind of bound to fairies in general. As we outlined, Spellstutter Sprite gets very powerful with more fairies in play, where essentially it becomes like a counter spell that has a 1/1 body attached to it. And who the heck doesn't want that? People were literally playing Snapcaster Mage because like at its floor, it was a 2-mana 2/1 that ended up like beating down like your control opponent or whatever, because they weren't expecting you to play a Snapcaster Mage for essentially no value. And Bitterblossom is a card that, definitely needs to be around for a while to accrue any sort of meaningful advantage. Again, it's like the third turn that it's in play, you end up, being at parity with damage, and then from turn 4 onwards, if you're able to attack and connect with all your tokens, you're getting even farther ahead in the damage race. And with the Modern format being at the point now where people just kind of don't care about you getting a 1/1 every turn. Their creatures are going to be bigger, they're going to be able to attack, you're going to be forcing to block with them. And then in a deck like Blue-Black Fairies, which is a archetype that shows up from time to time in Modern, does very well at like a tournament or two and then just kind of goes away. It doesn't really have like a good catch-up mechanic. Like, sure, you can play cards like Damnation to kind of like rat the board, reset it and everything, but we have people that want to play cards like Spell Pierce. You have Counterspell that is now legal in the format, which I'm sure fairies could probably benefit from that. But by and large, Bitterblossom just doesn't pack nearly as the punch that it once had. And if you try to play this outside of like fairy archetypes, I mean, it's fine just having an enchantment that makes a 1/1 every turn, and like playing this in certain matchups is probably going to be pretty good. But definitely in a world now where we have, a million different ways to kill 1 toughness creatures, we have plenty of ways, like even in the main deck, in certain decks, where we can get rid of enchantments, which enchantment, for at least then, was very hard to deal with, back in the day. Now is a little bit more manageable to handle, on top of the fact as well that, it isn't there in terms of power level anymore. So, I mean, unfortunately for Bitterblossom, it is unceremoniously like booted out of the format. I can't remember specifically if I think Bitterblossom was legal in Modern, and even then, like even as far back as like 2013, I don't remember, anybody really playing with Bitterblossom, at least to the capacity where it was like a full 4 of copy and a lot of decks. Of course, Bitterblossom, like one by itself, is very good, and multiple copies, it gets a little bit more dangerous for like your life total, but at the same time, like you're adding 2 power to the board, losing 2 life every turn. We talked about how fast like one Bitterblossom like outpaces the life loss. Imagine like 2 and how fast like you outpace that as well. So, yeah, Bitterblossom, very powerful card. I think even by today's standards is still a pretty powerful card. Just unfortunately, the creature type and like all the benefits and stuff that it once had just don't really exist in modern anymore, or at least hasn't been explored enough to where it can carve out like a niche in modern. Of course, Legacy definitely too powerful for it. People just can gain too much life in that format, and just even just win the game like through Bitterblossom, like not even necessarily just like gaining the life and stuff, because I can't remember if Uro is actually legal in Legacy, but definitely these like 4-color piles where like you have like Minx Boo that can trample over these things. You have like Bowmaster and stuff in Modern and Legacy as well that can just kind of pick them off one by one. And being a control deck, and like in essence wanting to be a control deck and like the archetype that Bitterblossom is in, you kind of want to have cards that kind of replace themselves in order to keep up with the format. And of course, Bowmaster punishes that, which means it's going to take out your fairies and then eventually take you out as well, forcing you to take those turns of losing a bunch of life, or losing a life every single turn, and really adding up when you have no board to show for it. So yeah, that is the unfortunate downfall of Bitterblossom, and why I kind of hope that, of the few cards that are modern legal, that are not legal in Pioneer, that don't see play in Modern, Bitterblossom is one that I would like to at least see tried in Pioneer. Like I'm definitely willing to, take a lot of swings at trying to, make cards that were, format staples at a time, that were very powerful, to try to give them a chance and a new life in a new format. So maybe Pioneer could be that place if we ever get a Return to Lorwyn set. If we see fairies and elves and Kithkin and all that being brought back to the forefront, that maybe Bitterblossom is like a card that can give it some life in a new format. So that's gonna do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on the video as well. Comment down below if you have any good or bad memories with Bitterblossom. If there's another card that deserves to be in the series, I will be looking to find some suggestions, things like that, and some other cards for the next video. Hopefully going to go a little bit more in depth than I've kind of showed off here, and put some better thoughts together. Maybe go with something a little bit more recent, just so like newer players and stuff have something to kind of latch some other memories on. But again, I would appreciate all the support on the channel, and that I really appreciate all the support that I have gotten already. And yeah, that's gonna do it for me this video. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next video.